Imagine, if you dare, a darkness so absolute, it swallows not just light but hope itself. A darkness woven with the metallic tang of fear, the thick, cloying sweetness of human waste, and the bitter, coppery taste of blood. Pause heavy. What if the only warmth you knew came from the press of bodies, ravaged by fever, slick with sweat and vomit? Pause, voice deepens. What if the rhythmic lullaby of the ocean was perpetually drowned out by the screams of the dying, the crack of the whip, and the silent, searing agony of a soul tearing apart? For countless souls, this was not a nightmare from which they could awaken. This was reality. This was the middle passage. The narrative body, the echo of a stolen dawn. Before the abyss there was light. There was the rustle of cornfields under an equatorial sun, the vibrant murmur of village life, the shared laughter around a crackling fire as stories spun tales of ancestors and spirits. There was the rhythmic pounding of pestles, the scent of wood smoke mingling with rich earth, the comforting weight of a child asleep on a mother's back. Pause, soft. There was the dignity of work, the sacredness of family, the deep, abiding connection to a land that had cradled generations. In the villages of Angola, of the Gold Coast, of Senegambia, life unfolded, complex and beautiful as it had for centuries. There were farmers, artisans, healers, kings and queens. There were lovers, siblings, children, elders, each thread vital in the rich tapestry of community. They knew the stars, the seasons, the language of the rivers. They knew joy. They knew sorrow. They knew belonging. Then came the rustle, not of wind through leaves, but of foreign boots on dry soil. The whisper, not of friendly gossip, but of fear rippling through the night. The flash, not of lightning, but of musket fire. Short, sharp sentences building tension. The sudden, brutal invasion. The shouts. The cries. The tearing apart. One moment, a man might be sharing a meal with his family, the next he was grappling with strangers, their faces obscured by the dim light of dawn, their language harsh and unintelligible. A woman might be preparing for market, only to find herself seized, her hands bound, her children ripped from her grasp. The air, once sweet with life, now reeked of terror and the acrid smoke of burning homes. This was not war as they knew it. This was abduction. This was rupture. The march of chains. A landscape of despair. The journey began not on the sea but on land. A forced march, sometimes for hundreds of miles, from the inland villages to the coastal forts, the Barracoons, holding pens for human cargo. Pause, slow. The sun beat down with relentless cruelty, baking the dust into a fine, suffocating powder that coated throats and eyes. Each step was an agony. Imagine the rough iron shackles chafing raw skin, the weight of them dragging, pulling, reminding you with every strained muscle of your stolen freedom. The cold, unyielding metal pressing into flesh, a constant, physical declaration of ownership. Thirst became a gnawing demon, parching mouths, cracking lips, blurring vision. Hunger a dull, constant ache in the belly, growing sharper with each passing, foodless day. Along the path bodies fell. The old, the weak, the sick, cast aside, left to the scavengers. Their silent departures were stark warnings, carved into the very landscape of suffering. Speak softly with profound sadness. The living dared not look back, dared not weep too loudly, for the lash, ever present, was quick to silence any outward display of grief. But inside, oceans of tears flowed, silent and scalding. They walked in silence, a procession of the condemned, stripped of dignity, robbed of names. Their minds, however, were a storm of unanswered questions. Where were they going? What awaited them? The unknown was a monstrous beast, growing larger with every mile. Memories of home, of loved ones, flickered like dying embers, precious and agonizing. To hold on to them was to suffer, but to let them go was to die a spiritual death. The Barracoons, threshold of the unfathomable. Finally the smell hit them. Not the clean scent of the ocean breeze they had known, but a thick, putrid aroma, a cocktail of human waste, unwashed bodies, fear, and an underlying, indescribable stench of despair. This was the coast. This was the Barracoon. These were not just holding cells, they were ovens of human anguish. Crammed together, shoulder to shoulder, sometimes for weeks or even months they waited. The air was heavy, humid, stagnant, alive with the buzzing of flies and the constant, low hum of human misery. Every breath was a shared testament to their confinement. Here their bodies were subjected to the first brutal inspections. Stripped naked, prodded, examined like livestock. Every flaw, every mark, scrutinized for its economic value. Voice trembles slightly with indignation. This was where their humanity was systematically chipped away, piece by agonizing piece. Then the branding. A searing iron pressed against flesh, leaving an indelible mark, the insignia of their new owners. A burning declaration that they were no longer simply people but property. The pain was acute, a white-hot knife twisting in the gut, but the deeper wound was to the spirit. This mark was meant to erase who they were, to forge them anew as chattel. And then they saw it. The ocean. A vast, terrifying expanse of water, churning and indifferent. For many it was the first time they had ever witnessed such immensity. This was not the familiar river, the gentle lake. This was a boundary, a chasm, separating them forever from all they had ever known. And waiting on its shimmering, deceptive surface, bobbing like a monstrous predator, were the ships. The hellish ascent. Boarding the death ship, the longboats approached, ferrying them from the shore. The rhythm of the oars, the spray of the unfamiliar salt water, the towering alien structure of the ship growing larger and larger with each stroke. It was a floating fortress, bristling with cannons, its sails like predatory wings. Its very presence screamed an unnatural menace. The gangplank. A bridge between two worlds. The known, however awful, and the utterly unknowable abyss. With chains still clanking, under the watchful, cold gaze of the sailors, they were forced up. Each step an act of profound surrender. The deck was a cacophony of sound. The creak of timbers, the snap of sails, the guttural commands of the crew, the terrified cries of those already aboard. The sun, once a source of warmth, now felt like a spotlight illuminating their naked shame, their utter vulnerability. But the deck was merely the antechamber. The true horror lay below. The descent into the abyss, the lower decks the hatchway. A dark maw swallowing bodies, swallowing souls. One by one they were forced down into the stifling, perpetual night of the ship's hold. The air hit them first, thick, oppressive, a suffocating blanket woven from the breath of hundreds, the stench of sickness, sweat, and impending death. It clawed at their throats, burned in their nostrils, leaving an acrid taste in their mouths. Down, down into the belly of the beast. The narrow steps, slick with unknown fluids, led into a darkness so profound, it felt as though their very eyes were being extinguished. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the exhaustion and despair. Imagine the absolute chaos. The scramble for a space, the terror of the unknown, the brutal efficiency of the crew pushing, shoving, herding them like cattle. The clinking of chains was no longer just a sound, it was the soundtrack to their new reality. The scramble for a space, the terror of the unknown, the brutal efficiency of the crew pushing, shoving, herding them like cattle. The clinking of chains was no longer just a sound, it was the soundtrack to their new reality. They were forced into impossibly cramped spaces. Shelves, barely 18 inches high, stretched across the hold. No room to sit upright, no room to stand. Short, sharp sentences. Only to lie, spooned against another body and another and another. Men, women, children, crammed so tightly that a single individual could barely shift without disturbing those around them. The chains returned. Heavier, more unforgiving. Ankle to ankle. Wrist to wrist. The cold iron bit into their flesh. An unyielding embrace that mocked any hope of movement, any dream of escape. This was not just confinement, it was a living burial. 60 days of darkness, the sensory hell of the Middle Passage. And so began the crossing. The Middle Passage. 460 agonizing days, sometimes longer, sometimes mercifully shorter, they were held captive in this floating tomb. The unrelenting stench. The most immediate and pervasive assault was the smell. It was a living entity, a suffocating beast that clung to every surface, every breath. The hold was a cesspool. Pause, emphasis. Imagine the concentrated odor of hundreds of human bodies, unwashed for weeks, months. Sweat, thick and sour. Urine seeping through porous wooden planks. Feces, often left where it fell, a horrifying sludge on the floor, smeared on bodies, coating the air. Vomit, from seasickness, from fear, from disease, added its own bile-ridden tang. Blood, from the lash, from struggles, from childbirth, from disease. The sickly sweet smell of decay, of death, was a constant companion, a grim perfume for the dying. This was not just a bad smell, it was a physical weight pressing down, forcing itself into every pore, every memory. It was the smell of dehumanization. The Symphony of Suffering. Silence was a luxury rarely granted. The hold was a constant chorus of human agony. Voice becomes strained. The low moans of the sick. The guttural coughs of consumption. The whimpers of terrified children, their small cries often stifled by a mother's desperate hand. The frantic whispers of those trying to communicate across the impossible crush of bodies. And then the shrieks. The piercing, soul-rending screams of those being whipped on deck, their pain echoing down into the darkness. The desperate cries of men going mad from the confinement, the hunger, the despair. The mournful wail for a loved one lost, for a life that was. Pause, deep breath. And beneath it all, the relentless creak and groan of the ship itself, a wooden monster traversing the indifferent ocean, its timbers moaning as if in complicity with the suffering it contained. The rhythmic slap of waves against the hull, a ceaseless reminder of the vast, cold emptiness surrounding them. The gnawing hunger and thirst. Food when it came was a meager, disgusting gruel, often boiled rice or yams, sometimes fufu. Thrown into troughs or simply spilled onto the floor for them to scramble for, their hands chained, their dignity pulverized. Short, sharp sentences. The taste was bland, monotonous, often mixed with salt water or filth. But hunger was a more powerful master than revulsion. They ate what they could, when they could, driven by the primal urge to survive, even as their bodies wasted away. Water was equally scarce, often brackish, rationed with cruel parsimony. The constant thirst was a burning fire in their throats, a torment that overshadowed almost everything else. Dehydration led to sickness, delirium, and often to death. The claustrophobic embrace. The physical constriction was a form of psychological torture. Voice tightens. Imagine lying for weeks, unable to stretch, unable to turn fully. Your arm trapped beneath another's body, pins and needles a constant companion. The wooden planks above you so close, so unyielding, pressing down. The bodies beside you, behind you, in front of you, an inescapable human tangle. The sheer physicality of this forced intimacy was profoundly violating. There was no privacy, no personal space, no moment of solitary reflection. Every breath you took was shared. Every illness, every moan, every struggle was communal. For those used to the open air, the vast spaces of their homelands, this confinement was a living death. The assault of disease. Disease ran rampant, unchecked, devastating. Voice becomes almost a detached, sorrowful recitation of facts. Dysentery, the bloody flux, spread like wildfire. It was a horrifying, uncontrollable purge that turned their cramped quarters into a horrific sewer, accelerating dehydration and weakening already starved bodies. Smallpox, its pustules erupting across skin, leaving scars on those who survived. Fevers raged, burning through bodies, leaving them delirious, helpless. Scurvy, gnawing at gums, loosening teeth. The sheer lack of hygiene, the malnutrition, the extreme stress, all combined to create a perfect breeding ground for epidemics. Death was not a visitor, it was a permanent resident, stalking the aisles, claiming its victims day and night. The cold, hard touch of iron and wood. The chains were a constant, chilling presence. Cold iron against warm skin, chafing, rubbing, creating open sores that festered in the damp, diseased air. The rough, splintered wood of the ship's planks, digging into backs, hips, shoulders, offering no comfort. The salt spray that sometimes found its way below deck, stinging their wounds. The coarse texture of their own unwashed skin, gritty with sweat and dirt. The touch of other bodies, sometimes a source of fleeting comfort, a shared humanity in despair, but often just another vector for disease, another press of unwashed flesh. The fading light of hope. In that perpetual twilight, hope became a fragile, almost dangerous thing. To hope was to invite crushing disappointment. Many simply succumbed to despair, choosing to refuse food, to fade away, to embrace death as a release. This act, known as fixed melancholy, was a quiet, profound form of resistance, a refusal to participate in their own enslavement. What does a mind conjure in such a place? Memories. Precious, agonizing shards of a life irrevocably lost. The face of a mother, etched in the mind's eye. The laughter of a child, now a haunting echo. The smell of home, a phantom perfume. They clung to these memories, even as they stabbed them with grief, for they were the last vestiges of who they once were. They whispered names ancient and sacred, to the indifferent darkness. They silently prayed to gods they hoped could hear them across the vast, terrifying ocean. Moments of defiance and connection. Yet even in this inferno, the human spirit, however battered, found ways to assert itself. Voice becomes more resilient, almost defiant. Whispers of shared language, a clandestine song hummed beneath the floorboards, a silent glance of understanding between two chained souls. These were tiny acts of rebellion, assertions of humanity against a system designed to strip it away. Sometimes a concerted uprising would erupt. A desperate, furious surge of chained bodies, momentarily fueled by an impossible hope. These were almost always brutally suppressed, the ringleaders flogged, starved, or summarily executed, their bodies thrown to the sharks as a chilling lesson. But the very act of rebellion, however futile, was a testament to the unquenchable fire of freedom that flickered even in the deepest dungeons of despair. And then there was the dancing. A grotesque spectacle. Once a day, weather permitting, some were brought up on deck, forced to dance for exercise. The sailors, often with whips, would make them jump, flail, sing. This was not for their well-being but to keep their muscles from atrophying, to keep them fit for market. A cruel parody of life, performed under the indifferent sun, their bodies performing a macabre ballet of forced vitality. The indifference of the captors. The men who ran these ships, the captains, the surgeons, the crew, operated within a system that systematically dehumanized their cargo. Voice becomes stark, almost chillingly objective. They saw not people but units of profit. Their ledgers recorded not names but numbers. A certain percentage of wastage was expected, factored into the economics of the trade. The surgeon, often tasked with ensuring the health of the enslaved, did so not out of compassion, but out of a pragmatic need to preserve valuable assets. Disease was a threat to profit, not a human tragedy. Brutality was a tool of control, a means to ensure order in an inherently volatile environment. They were caught in their own moral vacuum, their souls calcified by the monstrous nature of their trade. Glimmers in the darkness, the will to endure. But the story of the Middle Passage is not just one of suffering. It is also a testament to the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible power of the human spirit to endure. In the face of absolute annihilation, a profound will to live, to simply be, persisted. They held on to stories. They nurtured fragments of their culture within the confines of the ship's hold. They found solace in the shared misery, creating a nascent, desperate community of suffering. A mother's hand finding her child's in the darkness. A silent, knowing look exchanged between two strangers who understood each other's torment. These were tiny, subversive acts of connection that affirmed their shared humanity. They carried their ancestors in their hearts, their languages on their tongues, their spirituality in their unwavering gaze toward an unseen world. They endured the unspeakable, not just to survive for themselves, but to carry the flame of their lineage into an uncertain future. They survived so that we might be here. Landfall, the bitter taste of a new world. Then one day the air shifted. A different scent on the breeze. Not the stench of the hold but something new, earth, unfamiliar vegetation. The sounds changed. The creak of the ship still there, but now mingled with the cries of unfamiliar birds, the distant murmur of human voices, not their captors. The joy of seeing solid ground, of escaping the suffocating prison of the ship, was immense. But it was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by a new wave of terror. This was not their land. This was a foreign shore and the torment was far from over. They were brought up on deck, often after a hurried, brutal cleaning and oiling of their bodies. A grotesque preparation for market. Their bodies, now gaunt, scarred and weakened, were to be made presentable, to conceal the ravages of the voyage. The fear in their eyes, however, could not be disguised. The first sight of this new world was bewildering. New plants, new faces, new smells. The sun, once a comfort, now felt like a harsh interrogator, revealing their nakedness, their vulnerability. Then came the sails. The auction block. The final, crushing act of dehumanization. Voice trembles with barely contained emotion. Families, who had clung together through the horrors of the passage, were ripped apart. Mothers separated from children. Husbands from wives. Siblings from siblings. The bonds of blood, forged in the crucible of unimaginable suffering, severed by the cold, calculating hammer of the auctioneer. Their individual pain was amplified, echoing through the generations. They were sold like livestock, examined, prodded, their bodies reduced to commodities, their souls ignored. And with the final fall of the gavel, they were no longer simply enslaved. They were assigned new names, new masters, new lives of forced labor and profound injustice. The Middle Passage had ended, but their new hell had just begun. The unbroken chain, from Middle Passage to modern day, the ships are long gone. The auction blocks stand only in faded photographs and history books. But the echoes of the Middle Passage reverberate still. Its legacy is etched not just in the annals of history, but in the very fabric of our world, in the collective memory of a people, and in the ongoing struggles for justice and equality. Consider the psychological wounds, inherited through generations. The trauma of forced separation, the systematic stripping of dignity, the profound violence. These scars do not simply disappear with time. They manifest in complex ways, shaping identity, resilience, and the enduring fight against systemic oppression. The Middle Passage laid the foundational trauma for centuries of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and the systemic inequalities that persist today. The initial dehumanization was so absolute, it created a blueprint for future subjugation. The idea that black lives were less valuable, less human, was forged in the brutal crucible of the slave ship. But the story does not end in despair. It cannot. Voice becomes firm, imbued with pride. For those who survived the Middle Passage were not merely victims. They were progenitors of an extraordinary resilience. They carried within them the seeds of their cultures, their spiritual beliefs, their music, their oral traditions. They passed down, often in clandestine ways, the strength, the ingenuity, the sheer will to survive against impossible odds. Think of the spirituals, born from the pain and hope of slavery, carrying coded messages of freedom and divine justice. Think of the cultural expressions, the culinary traditions, the family values that, despite every attempt to obliterate them, endured and flourished. These were direct inheritances from those who traversed the dark waters, who refused to let their spirit be extinguished. The courage it took to simply draw another breath in that suffocating hold. The determination to protect a child amidst the horror. The quiet defiance in holding on to one's language or faith. These acts of endurance, repeated by millions, forged a legacy of strength that defines black communities today. The struggles of today, for racial justice, for equity, for the recognition of black humanity, are deeply rooted in this historical trauma. Understanding the sensory horror of the Middle Passage is not just about recounting a historical event. It is about comprehending the profound depths from which a people rose and continue to rise. It is about acknowledging the foundational injustice that demands continued reckoning and repair. From the unspeakable darkness of the slave ship, a light of resilience emerged. A people, battered but not broken, carried forward the flame of humanity, culture, and an unyielding demand for freedom.
Their journey, 60 days of hell, became the bitter foundation for a spirit that, against all odds, refuses to be silenced, refuses to be forgotten. It is a spirit that still breathes, still fights, still hopes, in every single person who carries the legacy of that passage. Outro. The Middle Passage was a journey into the abyss, a testament to humanity's capacity for cruelty, but also for an almost divine endurance. We have looked into that darkness, felt the phantom chains, smelled the stench of despair, and heard the cries that echo through time. And so, we are left with this question. How do we honor the memory of those who endured the unimaginable, not just by remembering their suffering, but by truly living the legacy of their unwavering will to survive and thrive? What does it mean, in our modern world, to carry the memory of those 60 days of darkness forward, not as a burden, but as a profound source of strength and a relentless call to justice?